This episode of Tools for the Future is all about grids and composition. I made this with my good friends Maria Judice and Sue Hong, so they deserve credit too for the content. Grids are used as an underlying structure for design. They don't have to be used rigidly, rather they help guide our design decisions. Even when there are no grid lines, and even if there's a lot of variation in elements on a screen or a page, our eye notices when these elements are aligned on the grid or not. The grid structure helps our eyes scan the page, read the elements, and connect relationships between them. Like most elements of design, the rules for applying grids and creating compositions really revolve around how the eye sees. A modular grid has consistent horizontal divisions from top to bottom, in addition to vertical divisions from left to right. These modules govern the placement and cropping of pictures as well as text. In the 1950s and 1960s, Swiss graphic designers, including Gerstner, Ruder, and Müller-Brockmann, devised modular grid systems like the one shown here. Some of these grid systems are built around an understanding of something called the golden section. The golden section describes a quote-unquote ideal relationship of proportions within a scene, but this is entirely culturally based. So the grid used by manuscripts followed the golden section in terms of layout and proportion. We can apply the same manuscript grid to new kinds of media, like digital media, if we like, but the questions that govern these choices should really be, how does this layout or composition make us feel? How easy is it to read? What's the overall tone created by it? There's also something called the baseline grid. This is a fairly rigid mathematical set of guidelines to help align various elements within a page or screen. These grids help us align different elements so that they have a proportional relation to each other. Column grids are used to create variation in proportions between elements. So a 16-column grid, for instance, can create 9 different proportional relationships. Not all of these will be appropriate at any given time. And again, the grid itself may not be visualized on the screen, but our eyes will notice the alignment and it will help us understand the contents of a screen or page. Obviously, the more columns in the grid, the more variations that can be created. But there's an upper limit to this. Too many columns and too many variations can just as easily create chaos as order. One of the great things about a column grid, especially with many columns, is it gives us lots of flexibility between applications of the same elements, especially if those elements appear on different devices or in different media. So while single column grids work well for simple documents, multi-column grids provide flexible formats for publications that have complex hierarchies or that integrate text and illustrations. The more columns you create, the more flexible your grid becomes. You can also use the grid to articulate the hierarchy of the publication by creating zones for different kinds of contents. A block of text or image can occupy a single column, or it can span several. And of course, not all of the space has to be filled. Modular grids are used to create variable placements with the same size proportion. We can use these symmetrically, for instance, or if we choose to, we can use them asymmetrically. Modular grids are useful because their flexibility gives us lots of options with different kinds of content. Here's an example of a multi-column grid. You can clearly see gutters and margins. At the same time, there's a lot of variation between these two examples. What's the first level of hierarchy that you see? What's the first read in the composition? What's the second? And what's the third? The grids help us establish these hierarchies and help communicate to readers the most and least important things on the page. Of course, breaking the grid is one of the greatest things to play with in design. There is a grid here, and you can clearly see where some elements are aligned, but the grid allows itself to be broken in interesting ways simply by being present. There's no end to how we might break a grid or use different typographic elements, but we should keep in mind the typographic decisions that we make and the effect it has on readers. Here's another example of the grid being broken, but within a controlled way. So we don't notice this example as chaos because of how the elements are used. Even though the grids for all three levels are different, they all work together. When we design for different screens and use cases, we need to keep in mind what's possible and still legible at each of these different sizes and proportions. We also have to keep in mind that for digital devices, they may very well be used in different orientations. Smartphones and tablets, for instance, can be used vertically or horizontally, while laptops are usually only used horizontally. The same is true of desktops. This variation just creates more things that we need to consider when we make our design decisions. Another thing to consider with digital design is that different screens have different resolutions. We've gotten pretty spoiled lately with smartphones and tablets having screen resolutions that are so high. This eliminates many legibility problems. However, not all screens are made the same, and you may be designing something that will show up on a screen that doesn't have as high legibility, which will require you to change the design specifications accordingly. Different applications allow you to create different kinds of grids. Sketch, for instance, in the layout settings, will allow you to create very complex grids if you like. Just keep in mind that what we're after is responsive design, meaning we understand how the same content and grid will flow from device to device and how that changes the elements that appear. What's immediately apparent here are the photographs, of course, but the thing that you should be paying most attention to is the type, particularly the headline, and how it lays out differently in each of these different settings. The thing that makes responsive or liquid adaptive designs work is understanding the breakpoints where columns end and content breaks. These often have to be specified in ranges so that the device has a little bit of leeway in how it breaks different kinds of content to fit the grid in different spaces. The Bootstrap grid system, for example, uses a 12-column grid and sizes things down to 2 columns on small devices. Clearly defining breakpoints for different size screens, desktop versus mobile, for instance, tablet versus laptop, will make all the difference in how your work shows up on different screens. Material design, for instance, has a nice grid system for laying out content on the web. In digital media, our aim is to have grid systems that are fluid, that move with the different devices and screen sizes, because fixed grids don't take advantage of all the screen real estate gracefully that's available. We also need to take into account how different operating systems render grids and typography in different ways. The same content moving from the web to an iOS device to Android to something else entirely may change the layout. So operating system and device are also circumstances we need to be aware of. This may change how we specify grids and compositions in order to work across these devices and applications more gracefully. When we design natively for some devices, they may have adverse impacts on other devices. Only if you know that absolutely your design is only showing up in one kind of situation, let's say smartphones using iOS. In this situation, you can design specifically for a screen size and a certain device. However, if your content is going to show up on different devices, you need to take into account the differences in those systems, and you'll probably want to use a responsive grid system. White space is a consistent element of great design. While some people look at this layout and say, what a waste of space, we could put so much more on that screen, others understand that the tension created between these two elements has a big impact on design. Nowhere has this been clearer than in some advertisements. This famous newspaper ad for Volkswagen, for instance, emphasizes the very message that Volkswagen is trying to communicate simply by using the white space effectively. You'll also see examples of white space used on business cards, for instance, where instead of filling the entire business card with text, the typeface is made smaller and the elements are arranged on the card in such a way to bring visual distinction to each part. White space is often critical in logotypes, for instance. Most people never even notice the white arrow between the E and the X in the FedEx logo, at least not consciously. But subconsciously, we can communicate different aspects of what we're trying to communicate simply by using our design tools, and white space is one of the best design tools for doing so. That's it for grids and composition. There's obviously much more to learn, but most of that learning needs to take place in experimenting with grids. There's only so much lecturing will ever teach us. Thank you.